Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Welcome back to my ExileCon coverage. Today I'm going to be talking about the patch 3.22 League. Now this is going to be discussion of things related to Path of Exile 1. If you're interested in my coverage on Path of Exile 2, I'll put a link down in the description below to everything that I've discussed about that in a separate video. And I also have a longer form stream, which I'll also put a link to down below, that you can click on if you're interested in discussing for a couple of hours all the ins and outs of the announcements in a lot more depth than I'll go into here. This is going to be the trimmed down version where we'll cover all the main points, but we will definitely miss a few little nuances. So patch 3.22 is called the Trial of the Ancestors, and this is going to have a new challenge league, which I believe personally has more in common with Blight than any previous league in terms of its gameplay. Much like Blight took an existing game mechanic from standalone games, in the case of Blight Tower Defense, and integrated it into Path of Exile in a way that your character could make up for your weaknesses in playing the Tower Defense game. Trial of the Ancestors is going to do the same thing, but instead of being Tower Defense based, it's going to be based on MOBAs like League of Legends. It's not going to be a carbon copy of a MOBA, but it's going to have a number of things in common with them. So in the Trial of the Ancestors itself, you'll visit the Karui Afterlife, and you will compete against 10 tribes in a tournament. This tournament will be double elimination, so if you do fail once, you're not completely knocked out. You'll be able to continue on, but if you fail twice, then you're out, start again. And each time you run through the tournament, you will not be fighting alone. You'll be fighting alongside allies. You'll be able to influence the party composition that you've got. Those allies won't be other players, they'll be NPCs, and you'll be fighting against a team of NPCs. Your goal is going to be to destroy the other team's totems, which will then permanently knock out one of their players each time that you defeat one of their totems, and they're trying to do the same thing to you. That's the core idea of the Trial of the Ancestors, and I think there'll be a lot of nuances that we'll work out over time. The way I'm expecting it to play out, and the reason that I think it will be reasonably similar to Blight, is that early in the league, when your character is still very weak, you're going to be dependent upon the powers of your allies to win. The powers of your allies and also your own tactics. Later on in league progression, you'll probably reach a point where you're able to take out the entire opposing team by yourself, and all of the tactics don't really matter. And that's pretty similar with Blight. Early on in progression, those towers really help. Much later on, you just kill everything by yourself, and the towers are there in case you either get bored, or in case you want to do a Blight Ravage map while you're completely AFK. So the Karui Afterlife has a number of just interesting screenshots that you can have a look at here. Nothing particularly revolutionary in these. These aren't about game mechanics, they're just about some of the aesthetic of the league. So this is the first shot, a second shot, and a third one. Gives you a sense of what to expect in terms of the core aesthetic of this league, what it's going to look like, and how it's going to feel. Now you'll be able to acquire silver coins while you're mapping. Those of you who played for a while might remember that these used to be tied to the prophecy mechanic and an NPC called Navali, who was then retired from the game. Well, Navali is back. She is now going to be your guide in this tournament. She will be taking silver coins, and they'll be used in order to participate in these tournaments. You'll then be able to assemble your team, and again, this is going to come down to a whole bunch of tactics that we'll probably be working out over days 1, 2, and 3 of the league. Once we've worked all of this out, there'll be a whole lot of guides that will come out. We'll be able to work out what works, what doesn't, and provide a whole bunch of information to that effect. You'll be able to trade in various favors, which are a currency that you'll gain for doing well in the tournaments, to either pick up new team members, so you could pick up this Lunar Tortoise if you wanted, or you can pick up some various single-use items like this Tidal Wave Idol. So this will do a whole bunch of damage and will assist you in winning the particular game that you're playing, but it is a single-use item. Probably only use it if you feel that you're the underdog going in, and then in that situation, it's there to help carry you in case that's what you need. Now, one of the things everyone always asks about is what are the rewards tied to this league, and there's going to be a number of new mechanics called tattoos. Passive tree tattoos transform nodes on your passive tree that otherwise would only provide attributes. There are passive tree tattoos that transform nodes that grant 10 attributes. Some of these are amazing. And there are passive tree tattoos that transform nodes that would otherwise give 30 of an attribute. Those seem to be much higher power so far, and I expect that there'll be a wide range of rarity in some of these items. First one here we have is a tattoo of the Namahu Firewalker. This changes a strength passive skill to become instead a fire resistance passive. If you've got all the strength you need, then this can be a nice little bonus that will take some pressure off your gearing, and it'll be particularly good with the new Chieftain, if the new Chieftain ends up being good enough to play. I'll make a separate video analysing the new Chieftain and the new Guardian in some depth, Currently, I think that the new Chieftain doesn't have enough to be a compelling ascendancy to play. It's probably better than the Gladiator and the Assassin, but it's not better than most other ascendancies. As a result, the strong synergies that it has with the tattoo of the Namahu Firewalker won't really come into play, and you can assess this item as though that ascendancy doesn't exist, which means that it's pretty marginal. It does do something useful, but it's not anything amazing. Next, we have the Loyalty Tattoo of Utula. This replaces a strength passive skill, again one of the 10 strength ones, and this grants trigger level 20 Summon Spirit of Utula on taking a savage hit from a unique enemy. However, you are limited to having only one loyalty tattoo. We have no idea how strong this is going to be. My gut feeling though is that this is going to be ridiculously powerful while you're leveling, because level 20 spells are usually balanced around a character level requirement of 69, and this makes them really, really nice if you can get them earlier in the game than that. So this is something that might be like the Crucible mods from 321 that cause the last node of your Glacial Cascade spells to fire off a massive Ice Nova that then does massive damage if you're doing it during the axe. I think this might be something you can't gain on your first character, but then on your second and subsequent characters may be very strong. Tattoo of the Ramako Scout replaces a small dex node with 2% movement speed, which is going to be a really strong thing to have a bunch of once you've got all the dexterity you need for all your gear and all your gems. Tattoo of the Valako Storm Conduit replaces a small int passive skill with gains 1 to 7 lightning damage. This is going to vary a lot in power from build to build. I think on most builds this is just not going to be enough damage to matter, but there'll be the oddball case that has enough percentage damage scaling to make this into something quite useful. Next we have the Honoured Tattoo of the Hatango, and this is a monster. This replaces any small attribute passive skill, so any 10 attribute node, and it grants 1% increased reservation efficiency of skills. Note that this applies to both life and mana reservation efficiency, so it's quite hard to get this as a stat for life skills. This is going to be really good because it seems like you can use them without limit, and I feel like this is going to be one of those late game power-ups like getting Catalyst on your rare jewelry that you're going to want a lot of, and they're just going to end up being really, really strong. Next we have the Honoured Tattoo of the Wise Man, and this one is a monster. Now note that you can only use one of these, but replaces a 30 intelligence notable passive skill. Now you might not otherwise intentionally take that 30 passive skill, but in this case you're absolutely taking it, because grants +1 to the level of all intelligence skill gems. This is a monster. This is an incredibly strong item, and this is going to be a big power boost. One thing I'm curious about is what's going to happen with these tattoos come the end of the league. Will they go into standard or will they be removed? Nothing has been clarified on this to the best of my knowledge as yet. Now there is a bit of a metagame effect of these tattoos, and that is that because these tattoos take otherwise useless nodes and transform them into something good, there is one build archetype that I think is not going to be played this league, and that is stat stacker builds. Stat stacker builds actually do care about the small nodes that are being overwritten by these tattoos, and as a result, stat stacker builds are going to miss out on all of the extra power that these tattoos offer. For that reason, I don't expect we will see many stat stacker builds this league, and I think we'll see either none or very little Meritir gear crafted for these types of builds. Basically, this is not going to be the league to play a stat stacker. If you've got that on your list of things to play in Path of Exile 1, then I would suggest that you bump it down for another league. However, there are a couple of interesting interactions, not necessarily strong but interesting, between the Incursion Transcendent Jewels and the Incursion Tempered Jewels and these tattoos. These are worth your while exploring, even if you don't end up deciding to use any of them in your final build. Next we have Omens. These are single-use triggered items of a very, very varied power level. So the Omen of Return is a single-use cast on death portal, which is just a convenience item, but it is something you probably want to carry 3 of while you're leveling, especially if you die as often as I do. The Omen of Refreshment might actually save you. Upon falling to 25% life or below, the Omen is consumed and all your flasks regain all charges. Now, in the spirit of mentioning some interesting interactions that may or may not be worth using, Omen of Refreshment is particularly interesting if you happen to have a Forbidden Taste unique flask that has the unusual choice of enchantment that this flask is used when its charges become full. So your Omen of Refreshment procs, its charges are immediately refilled, and then you immediately drink from it, which is then going to replenish at least 75% of your life and potentially your entire life pool if you have a perfectly rolled version of that flask. This is not necessarily super strong, but it's at least something interesting. Drawback is that you can only use one Omen in each combat area, and as a result, it may just not end up being worthwhile. The opportunity cost may be too high, especially given that you have to use a flask in a pretty unusual way. That was my first thought when I saw this, but you could just use it in conjunction with generally good flasks as well, as a bit of a get out of jail free card. Omen of the Soul Devourer is going to be a lot of fun when leveling up. Upon you leveling up, the Omen is consumed and you gain Soul Eater. Now, Soul Eater normally lasts for 20 seconds, but there's no time limit explained on this item. I don't know whether it's going to be 20 seconds or whether it's going to be until you leave the zone, but either way, it's going to be a huge power boost after you level up, and I think these are just going to be a lot of fun to use. I can definitely imagine characters packing 10 of these when they're leveling just for a bit of a laugh. They're going to give you a tremendous speed boost, especially once you get to the point that attack speed from Soul Eater translates into movement speed. Once you get the appropriate movement skills, this is going to be crazy. Next, we have the Omen of Fortune. If people remember Trash to Treasure, it used to be a prophecy back when prophecy mechanic was around. It was a way of turbocharging your next Chance Orb, and it would turbocharge the Chance Orb to guarantee a unique item. Omen of Fortune is exactly the same thing. Upon using an Orb of Chance on an item, it will become unique if possible, and this Omen will be consumed. Now, Omen of Fortune is going to be a very, very, very rare drop, and that means it's going to be precious. You're going to want to use it very selectively and only on the best possible candidate items. One example that I would give here is imagine that you're running an Enchanted Armaments heist, and one of the curios has a prophecy wand that has the enchant on it, 15% increased magnitude of caster modifiers. You see that and think, gee, this would be incredible if I Scour Chance this into a Void Battery. That is the sort of item you would want to use a Chance Orb and an Omen of Fortune to then transform into a Void Battery. Because Void Battery is such a rare unique, this is something that might have taken thousands, maybe even 10,000 or more Scouring Orbs and Chance Orbs. Instead, you can get there with one Scouring Orb and one Chance Orb and one Omen of Fortune. And additionally, you'll save yourself a ridiculous number of clicks. So that's going to be their primary use case. You can also use it in conjunction with influenced items if there's some reason that you want an influenced version of a unique item, something that can't otherwise normally drop. That's going to be the best use case for this item. And remember, it's going to be something precious. It's going to be something special. It's going to be something extraordinarily rare, and most players will not have one of these drop for them. Next, we have the best item that I've seen in a long time. This is the new Eternal Orb. This is Hinakora's Lock. And these things are absolutely crazy. So there's a couple of ways that you can interpret the text on this, and we're just going to have to test it in-game, unless Grinding Gear Games come out with a clarification before the league start as to exactly which of these it is. The way that I personally read this is that applying Hinakora's Lock to an item essentially gives you a save state like an Eternal Orb does, but that save state only works for one modification by a currency orb. So let's say that you apply a Hinakora's Lock to an item, then you apply an Exalted Orb to it, and that Exalted Orb gives you a bad result. In that case, you can then decide, I'm actually not going to go through with that Exalted Orb, and then you'll need to make a different modification to the item in order to then be able to apply another Hinakora's Lock before you then attempt to do an Exalted Orb later. However, modifying the item in any way removes the ability to foresee. The unclear thing is how permanent this removal of the ability to foresee is. The two possible interpretations I'm aware of the permanence of this last line. One of them is to say that modifying the item in any way removes the ability to foresee that was granted by this Hinakora's Lock, but doesn't prevent you from then applying another Hinakora's Lock to the item and then trying again with a foreseen currency outcome. The other possibility, though, is that once you have removed the ability to foresee from an item, that it can never regain it. It's not really clear which of those is the case. The other thing that's not clear about Hinakora's Lock is what happens to the currency orb that you considered using on the item. Now, this isn't going to matter all that much with an Exalted Orb, because Exalted Orbs are going to be much cheaper than a Hinakora's Lock is. However, it's going to matter a lot if you're considering using a Fracturing Orb on an item, and you're thinking, all right, I'm going to apply a Hinakora's Lock to make sure that I don't ruin the item, then I'm going to test out with a Fracturing Orb, will I get a favorable result or not? If you get a favorable result, absolutely commit the Fracturing Orb. But if you don't get a favorable result, do you lose the Fracturing Orb or not? Again, this isn't entirely clear. Hinakora's Lock looks like it's a ridiculously powerful currency orb. It definitely will be. It's going to be amazing in conjunction with Elder Slayer's Exalted Orbs in particular, but these nuances are going to be the difference between whether this is the new Eternal Orb or whether this is just a powerful crafting tool that's going to be something that you will use a few of in a league, and that they'll be fairly expensive, but they're not going to be ridiculous. We also don't know how this is going to interact with Vaal corruptions from a Vaal Orb or other sources. Vaal Orbs interact in the worst possible way with Eternal Orbs, and I don't know whether this is going to be the same case with Hinakora's Lock, or whether Hinakora's Lock is going to have its full power when used in conjunction with Vaal Orbs. Whatever the case, Hinakora's Lock is going to be an expensive item, especially if the more favourable interpretations of how the texts on it work actually end up being correct, and I can see these being very, very valuable, both in the 3.22 Ancestor League, but also of extreme value to people who play in Standard. And because there is an overlap between the Standard player base and the League player base, there will be a section of the League player base that are looking to pay extreme prices for these, because they're confident that they can then just take them to Standard and sell them for a very large amount of currency there, and they actually are concerned about their Standard currency. So this is going to be an interesting one to see how it plays out. I do think this is going to be one of the most impactful crafting things added to the game in a while. Probably the most significant thing since Recombinators, although I don't expect it to have the same effect as Recombinators did on the Sentinel League. Next, there's a couple of unique items. Now, sometimes they spoil good uniques early, sometimes they don't. 3.22 is a case where GGG have either decided we're going to sit on the good uniques, or they know there's none. I think there'll probably be some good uniques, but these ones are not particularly exciting. We have Bound Fate, which is an RNG heavy belt that I just can't see myself using. We have an amulet, and unfortunately the amulet slot is just so contested at the moment. Rare amulets are so good, Crystallized Omniscience is so good, Ashes of the Stars is so good. There's just so much that's available in the amulet slot. Even All's Uprising is hard to fit, and this is definitely not All's Uprising. However, if you are playing a character that is always on low life, and this is something that can be done a lot of ways, then in that situation, using a life flask will give you all the benefits of a seething life flask, i.e. the life recovery occurs instantly, but without any of the drawbacks. This is a pretty powerful effect. I'm just not willing to give up my amulet slot for it. At least I'm unwilling to give up my amulet slot for this at endgame. While leveling, this could be an extremely good item. And next we have Kitava's Hunger, which is one of the more interesting items here. This is a really potentially powerful chess piece that has a lot of the benefits of Kalm's Heart, and not just the current Kalm's Heart, but the legacy version, because the life roll on this does definitely go up as high as 910. However, it does this with a different drawback. Where Kalm's Heart prevents you from socketing anything into your chest, Kitava's Hunger doesn't have that drawback, but instead, it prevents you from using items in other slots that have life modifiers on them. I mean, you can still equip them, but doing so is going to have reasonably disappointing results, because suddenly a Kitava's Hunger is going to turn out to be not much better than a magic chess piece would be. However, 858 life, or 910 as we saw on another screenshot, is actually a very large amount, and it means that you can have ROG crafted items in all your other slots that have no life on them. ROG crafts really good items that are missing life a lot of the time, and so there is definitely a potential for this item. That said, I think the chess slot is probably too competitive. So hopefully there's a couple of other uniques that are more interesting that are being held back. Those are the three we've got so far. One trash, one underwhelming, and one interesting but probably not going to get there. Next, we have the news that is going to definitely excite a lot of people, and that is that the Forbidden Sanctum is going core. The Forbidden Sanctum will start when you loot a Forbidden Tome. These, we don't have any information on how they drop as yet. I assume this information will get teased before the league starts. Maybe GGG have just decided, nah, we'll just let them find it in-game. But this is the sort of thing I think will probably be about the same rarity as Heist Blueprints, but assuming that Heist Blueprints didn't drop from Smuggler's Caches. So pretty rare, but not staggeringly rare. Sort of about as rare as a Divine Orb. That's going to get you started in your Sanctum, and then once you're there, there's going to be a few new mechanics to the Sanctum. The first one is that every time you complete a floor, you will be able to itemize your Sanctum, and then if you don't feel confident that you can beat it, you can then go and sell it to another player. For example, if you're someone that's not that experienced with Sanctum content, you might find yourself in a situation where you've saved a couple of Divine Orbs as the rewards for clearing the entire Sanctum, but you've got a number of afflictions you can't really handle very well, and you're getting pretty low on resolve. You manage to finish a floor, and now at this point, you've got the option of saying, you know what, I'm just going to sell this to someone else. I know that if that person's able to complete this Sanctum, they're going to walk away from it with 3 Divine Orbs because that's banked. I don't think I'm going to get those Divine Orbs, but maybe I can split 50-50 with that player. Maybe they'll buy it off me for 1.5 Divine Orbs. Maybe you'll even be able to negotiate 2. This is going to be an interesting dynamic, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it plays out and how much of a market there is in trade leagues in particular for Sanctums that have been started with a promising start but that have some flaws with them that make them harder to run. We have the various relics that are going to be around. These have been changed a little bit. And we also have the Broken Censer. This is one of the unique relics. Here, rooms are unknown on the Sanctum map is the drawback, but the Herald of the Scourge is going to drop 2 additional Forbidden Tomes, i.e. 2 more access keys to the Forbidden Sanctum. So a whole lot of things have been changed here. It's not an exact copy of how it was in Sanctum League, but it does look like it will scratch that itch for people who like Sanctum, which did seem to be a large percentage of the player base. It was one of the more popular leagues in recent times. Sanctum is also changing the way that it interacts with character defenses as well. What's happening is that the Sanctum is going to give you some mitigation of resolve damage based upon your character's core defenses. These core defenses will provide some mitigation of incoming damage to your resolve. For example, armor will be a flat percentage reduction, evasion will be a percentage chance to avoid resolve reduction, an energy shield will provide you with an ablative shield that will replenish itself over time and that will reduce 50% of resolve damage while it is up, but then once it breaks, all of the resolve damage is going to come through. So essentially, energy shield will be the best one against small hits, armor will be the best against medium-sized resolve hits, and evasion will be the best defense against resolve that hits so hard that it's going to one-shot you. But whatever your character specializes in, the Sanctum will actually reward you a bit more for it. So that's going to be an interesting change to see how that plays out. I think this will be well received because Forbidden Sanctum was one of those league mechanics that seemed to be loved by about 3/5 of the player base. The other 2/5 of the player base couldn't care less. But the thing is that for those 2/5 that couldn't care less, you can now just pick up your Forbidden Tomes and you can trade them to someone else. So this is going to be one of those win-win situations where if you like Sanctum, you can live in it. And if you don't like Sanctum very much, then you can mostly ignore it, and then once or twice engage with it for a league challenge or something along those lines. The next thing that's coming up is the significant changes that are happening to Endgame and the Atlas. Now these are going to be keystones. Those of you that played in both 3.17 and 3.18 will have a sense of how significant a keystone can be. They can have a pretty transformative effect upon the Atlas experience. However, these seem to be more mechanic tied and they're quite interesting. So rather than having something that just is a flat buff to a mechanic, these transform the way mechanics work. Let's start by discussing Extreme Archaeology. This one looks fun. Instead of you having 5, 6 or 7 small explosives when you're doing expedition content, you will instead have one. But it won't just be an explosive, it'll be a tactical nuke. These things will blow up an enormous percentage of the entire expedition encounter. Sometimes this is going to be fantastic. Other times this is going to result in a very unpleasant situation where there is a fire immunity node right in the middle, and it will end up not quite bricking the entire expedition because you'll still find an area you can hit, but it will be much worse than it otherwise would have been. I think if you do split damage between multiple elements, for example a Trinity build, then this is going to be much stronger than if you do single element damage, even if that single element damage otherwise does well against expedition content. Next we have Lucid Dreams, which looks like a terrible node at first. Vaal side areas in your maps are no longer corrupted. You're thinking already, big whoopee, why would I ever roll these? Well, Vaal side areas are getting a number of new mods. One of the ones that was teased was that the Vaal vessel contains an additional ultimatum aspect. Now that's presumably quite rare, but the fact that they're adding at least a couple of extra rewards to these means that there's some potential for them to be fairly good. We're going to have to play around with this one. My first thought is that this is not very strong, but that it has some potential, and I would not in any way be surprised if my first impressions are proven wrong on it. Finally, we have Destructive Play. Now this is intended to be a Maven Witness equivalent of Wrath of the Cosmos or Eldritch Gaze, something that is going to juice up Maven influence maps by a lot. However, it's not really clear what the upside of this does. So the Maven summons 1 to 3 additional bosses when witnessing map bosses. Modifiers to the final map boss in each map also apply to those summoned bosses. Now, with the second line, the first thing I was thinking was, oh, that's going to be absolutely amazing in conjunction with Eldritch Altars that provide a bonus to the loot dropped by the final map boss. However, that is definitely not the case because you can't be both Maven Witnessed and also Searing Exarch Witnessed. It's either or. So it's not going to work in that way. What we don't know is whether this is going to cause those additional witness bosses to be added into the Maven's witness pool. I believe it probably will. That's my interpretation of how this looks like it works. And that's going to mean you'll be able to cycle through Maven 10 ways pretty quickly, and you'll be able to gather Maven's writs from them quite quickly as well. Will that be worth as much as running Searing Exarch maps with Wrath of the Cosmos? I think the answer is going to be no, but at least it's going to be a little bit closer than it was in the past. There's also going to be 16 other Keystone passives. One of the other ones is going to modify Blights to make Blight into much more of a tower defense game. And yet another is going to give an excuse for keeping Torment in the game that actually looks like it might work. Tormented Spirits will possess you, the player, instead of just running around and dying while they're trying to possess a rare monster. What I think will be really interesting will be seeing what they are for some of the other mechanics. How does a Keystone passive for Legion work? How does a Keystone passive for Breach work? How does a Keystone passive for Heist work? All of these are going to be worth our while having a serious look at, because I think that's probably going to be the case that most of them will be mediocre, but that some of them will be amazing, and we're going to have a look at what all of them do. Next, we have a couple of new support gems. Now, the first one of these screams nerf, and that's because this is returning projectile support. Many of you are no doubt familiar with Vengeance Cascade. Vengeance Cascade gives you all of the benefits of returning projectile support with none of the drawbacks, and it takes your Amulet's anointment slot only. For that reason, I'm pretty confident that returning projectile support is going to be entirely replacing Vengeance Cascade. Vengeance Cascade might exist in some continuing form, but I think we're going to see this as the new replacement for making projectiles return to you. If you want that mechanic, then fantastic, you can get it, but it's no longer going to be a massive damage multiplier like it was in patch 3.21, where it was so good that pretty much every projectile build had to use it. And next we have a support gem that takes two of the most unpopular skills in the game and combines them. So if you've ever wanted to mix Searing Bond with Link skills, Frigid Bond support is going to allow you to do that. Honestly, this I don't see being used much at all. The numbers on it are not much higher than they are on Searing Bond, and really I just can't see this having much appeal at all. That said, it does have some synergy with one of the nodes on the new Guardian, so maybe someone will try and make a meme build with it, and who knows, meme builds have done some pretty impressive stuff in the game. I know people have defeated endgame bosses on Flame Dash totems. If they can do it with Flame Dash totems, then they can do it with Frigid Bond support as well. Next we have the Guardian Ascendancy overhaul. Now, the Guardian Ascendancy is somewhat of a new beast, and this is going to need its own video for it. It's certainly not a straight buff, but it does have some interesting things in it. One of the things that I think is among the most interesting is Time of Needs change. Now, this has the text every 4 seconds regenerate 100% of life over 1 second. Now, this is something that is not what I consider a very strong mechanic unless you're trying to convert that life into something else. And what else could you convert that into? Well, Time of Need is actually incredibly good in conjunction with Calm's Spirit. And so I can see some people messing around with that combination. Whether that is on a Guardian or whether that is something that is Forbidden Flame, Forbidden Fleshed out of the Guardian into another Ascendancy is another question. But there is definitely a synergy there. What exactly comes of that will be interesting to see. Otherwise, there's a couple of nodes in this that we can't really judge because we don't have the full context. What exactly is a summoned Sentinel of Radiance? What is a summoned Elemental Relic? Once we get that information, we'll be able to assess better what state the Guardian is in. That said, my overarching thoughts are that this is going to be a bit of a nerf for builds that are min-maxed around the existing version of Radiant Faith, but that there's going to be a lot of power in here for some new builds to be played around with. Next we have the Chieftain, which is interesting in that this is the Ascendancy I have seen the most divergent opinions on. Now, my thoughts on this Ascendancy are that it's going to be solidly B or C tier. It is not going to be as bad as the Assassin is, it is not going to be as bad as the Gladiator is, but it does not have a coherent 4 nodes for every build, and there's just a bunch of things that are pushing in different directions here, and there's not enough damage on the Ascendancy. This does have the best mitigation of elemental damage that you'll find on any Ascendancy that is not named Juggernaut, and it also has Tassalio Cleansing Water, which was already a good node. It's now something completely different, but this is an interesting one in that Tassalio is going to provide you with a staggering amount of slot consolidation. Essentially, if you have a mod on an item that grants 50 to fire resistance, that mod is also going to grant 25% cold resist and 25% lightning resistance. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but then you think that actually resistances is something you have to get from somewhere, and Tassalio is going to fill a lot of those in for you, and as a result, it's going to free up a lot of suffixes on your gear to be spent on other mods. Then you have Velako Storm's Embrace, which gives you the upside of Melding of the Flesh, at least not exactly Melding of the Flesh, but something reasonably similar to it, without the massive drawbacks that that item has. And so this node is incredibly good, but it's a 4-pointer. The problem is going from here to a coherent set of 4 nodes that work for a build. There's a bunch of different possibilities that you can go with, but most of the time other builds will find 2 points that they can spend very profitably, but then they're going to have to settle for something mediocre like Hinekora Death's Fury, where enemies you kill have a 5% chance to explode, even though the amount of damage is absolutely staggering, 500% of their maximum life. This is still a 5% explosion chance, which usually isn't going to be worth 2 points on an Ascendancy. So you're going to be stuck taking something like that, whereas a different Ascendancy will be stuck taking their worst points, being something that gives them 12 or 14% more damage on their character. So all in all, I think that the Chieftain Ascendancy overhaul is lacking a little bit of cohesiveness in places and probably lacking a bit of damage. There's some interesting things there, and it's going to be fun to play around with, but I'm not sure that it's going to be anything other than a middle to low tier Ascendancy in 3.22 as it is. Finally, Grinding Gear Games are running a launch event where there is going to be a race in Hardcore Solo Self-Found to kill the 7 Uber Pinnacle bosses. So if you are feeling confident that you can do that in Hardcore Solo Self-Found and do it fast, because this contest will be won very quickly, there'll be more information coming about that soon. And also, if you don't feel like you can actually be competitive in it, it can still be a lot of fun to watch. Or even if you don't watch it, but you just draw inspiration from the builds that people use, that can also be really useful as well. Finally, there's new supporter packs, as you would expect, and one of them has an S tier armor set in it. But that's Grinding Gear Games' job to advertise, not mine, so you can have a look at those if you're interested in them. That's what we've got on patch 3.22 so far. There's a lot in this, there's a lot of interesting things going on. I kind of feel they haven't hit the nail on the head with the Chieftain or the Guardian Ascendancy overhauls the way that they did with the Trickster. There is stuff there, but I don't think it's going to get there, and I think the most popular use of Chieftain is going to be to take one of the 2 best nodes, which is either going to be Volako Storm's Embrace, where modifiers to maximum fire resist also apply to maximum cold and maximum lightning resistance, or they're going to take Ramako Sun's Light. Nearby enemies have no fire resistance against damage over time while you are stationary, and they're going to export those onto another Ascendancy through the use of Forbidden Jewels. I think that's going to be the most popular way to take advantage of the new Chieftain, and I hope I'm wrong on that. Anyways, that is 3.22, a wrap-up. May your Valobs have interesting results, and I will see you around for day 2 of ExileCon tomorrow, or maybe today, depending on your time zone.